Well, I guess we may as well start since everybody's here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'm appreciative on Sunday afternoon, so it's really great. I'd like to thank everybody individually for showing up here, and we have Quincy Saul on clarinets, and Tim Gilmore on drums, and Peter Concilio playing bass, and Jared Grinnell is recording for WCTV, which we're really happy about. And we're going to play. Have an unusual selection, I think. We're going to start with a tune we played last time called the Nakatini Serenade. And when we played it last time, I said this is a tune that should be played more often. And then I thought, well, we'll play it again. You know, and I didn't really say enough about Cal Massey, the composer of this song, who was played trumpet, and he was a Philadelphia musician. And he maybe one of the things that's timely because he wrote a suite of music, the African American Liberation Suite, and there are CDs of it that are available for free, except the price of it is you have to intend to listen to it. And Cal Massey, because he had that interest in African American stuff and justice, he didn't work and play and get as much recognition as he should have. It should have been like a thing, well, we like him more for that, but instead it was the opposite. And so a lot of this stuff it's beautiful for itself and worth listening to, I think. So the Nakatini Serenade was just recorded one time, and I found the music for it online and just copied it. And here it's people, you can do stuff like that. So we're going to play Nakatini Serenade. So I guess if you want to do the first two notes, we'll know the tempo, or shall I count it? Or just jump right in on it. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. All right. Thank you. It's a beautiful song. Thank you. We're going to continue. The next tune, I need to say something about. I wrote this tune about 5 years ago for this guy, Abdullah Öcalan, who's been and the song is part of it from a suite, and this one's called, it's part two in the suite, and it's 5/4, and it's called Identity. And the Öcalan recently was in the news again because he's been a prisoner in Turkey for a long time, and he recently made a statement and suggested that the organization which he started 30 years ago disband. And Öcalan is a Kurdish person, and his the idea of identity in this song is that he resisted the Turkish oppression and attempt to wipe out the Kurdish people and forbid them to speak their language and live. So he did it by forming a military resistance as well as a political resistance. And in jail, he changed his mind about a lot of the things that he'd done. He changed his identity, in fact, and he wrote a wonderful bunch of writings that I think Abdullah Öcalan, if everybody likes political science, I think his political philosophy is one of the most advanced that I've come across. And I think, as I said once before, it's advanced like, what do you mean advanced? It's like calculus compared to arithmetic or something. He's done a lot of thinking. It's way. So anyway, this is little. What are you going to do if you think something like that, and you think it a lot? Sometimes you think, I'll write a song. So we've got one, and my son and friend Quincy hit me to who Abdullah Öcalan was. I didn't really know, but I was very impressed. And he wrote a history of the world and history of politics. And this is just an attempt to kind of excuse to talk about Öcalan. But the music, I think, holds up. So we're going to play it. And this is all right. I did.
Did you write that?
I did write that.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
You should have invited people to dance.
Yeah, feel free to help me out with this. Get up in. Well, and part of the next tune, we're going to play a song by Charles Mingus. It was called "Fables of Phoebus," and definitely has some political overtones. When it was first sung, it was Phoebus, I think, was the governor of Georgia, who tried to prevent the black children from going to school, and something happened that could never happen again. That the federal, the army was called in, and they escorted the kids to the school, and so they got to happen. But Mingus wrote this song expressing his feelings about Phoebus and the political feeling of being. What do they say? Don't let them smother us. And it was really standing up to the Phoebus. He said one of the lines in it was, "Name me a handful that's ridiculous. Name me a handful that's ridiculous." And he says, Eisenhower Dulles. And there's all these names, all these contemporary figures of the day. And he says, Danny Richmond, "Name me a handful that's ridiculous, Danny." And he names like 4 or 5 others, like that are right on the tip of his tongue. So we could do something like that easily, like name me a handful that's ridiculous. We all have our list, it could be a long list, yeah. It's like that, yeah. So I thought it was worth singing a song, and playing the song, and not singing a song. But musically, with Charles Mingus, the music was always great, and it had a political punch, for sure. And these songs, but the music always made a lot of sense. So, or better, was sometimes very beautiful. So we're going to play Fables of Phoebus, 2025 version. So I guess you started. It was a tricky song. Yeah, no, good. Now we're going to play one that's more peaceful, called called "Peace." It was a famous song of great piano player Horace Silver, called "Peace." I thought after the two politically tinged songs, one of it'd be nice to recall the thoughts of peace. It's a place I know where the sycamores grow and daffodils have their fun, where the cares of the day seem to slowly fade away and the warmth of the noonday sun. Living has just begun. That's the first verse of a 5-verse song, lyrics. We'll play it. So, 1, 2, 3. All right, thanks. Now we're going to play. Tim Gilmore has lately been composing some music for us, so I'm really happy that we got another.
We know the end is near.
The end times have come.
Yeah. So that's a tune you want to talk about, or just play
Sure,
it?
this is started from not a very deep concept at all. I found I have 2 adult children that are periodically living with me, so with my wife and I, there's a lot of laundry and stuff, and I was cleaning up in the laundry room, and I found 2 mismatched socks that nobody laid claim to, so I ended up looking at them, and I'm going, boy, these look like pretty unhappy socks. So I wrote the song as a tribute to the 2 unhappy socks. But if you're philosophical, you could extend that into much more political, whatever. But really, the concept was that simple and that trite. 2 unhappy socks.
Nice. Hey. We have one more tune in this set, and we're going to take a break after that. This is another tune by Charles Mingus, which I didn't know until I'd heard it, but I didn't really zero in on it until we were practicing for this. It's a tune called Jelly Roll in honor of Jelly Roll Morton, and it's Jelly Roll Morton is sort of legendary and famous, but in some respects nobody's ever heard of him. And he claims to have invented jazz and has a good claim to that, even though it sounds ridiculous. He probably, if anybody could have done it, he could have done it. And we're going to, I think the song itself will give a good feeling for who Jelly Roll Morton is. And Mingus had this deep appreciation for the history of music, and was not shy about exhibiting it. Yeah. All right. 1, 2, 3. Thanks everybody for hanging out and listening to our first set. We're going to take a brief break. And
musicians here this evening. Really, really nice to have musicians come to the musicians. And we also, I want to introduce, if I may, the creator of Tango Tonight, which they produced in. They did a reading in Woodstock. Joy Costa is the person who wrote and directed, and she is remarkable. She's sitting right there.
all right, yeah, all right. Yeah. No, I agree. It's great to have not only musicians but knowledgeable listeners, and we have a bunch of them. So it's great. And we're going to start this set with a song that I wrote almost inadvertently. For getting ready for this, I asked Quincy if there's anything he wanted to play, and he was looking through this book that I have of songs, and he said one of them he wrote down was "How High the Moon," and I started to try to play that song. I couldn't really find a way that I could get into it, so I wound up changing the time signature and rewriting the melody. It became a whole different thing, and and that's what we're going to play. It's, I gave it a moon title. It's called "Three-Quarter Moon." So if you know How High the Moon, you'll probably get the joke a little bit. All right. thanks. Thank you. Yeah, that was nice. A few little musical jokes in there. But our next tune is going to play. It's a tune by this great teacher that I was fortunate enough to study with 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in the 1970s. Dennis Sandoli, who was, I think he's one of the unknown person, but one of the great teachers of the 20th century. And he didn't write enough this kind of tunes, but this is a tune he did write. It's called "Wayward Plaint." And I think one of the nice things I've discovered in playing this tune with different people that it sounds listenable and like it could be part of anybody's repertoire, but it always makes people play a little differently than they usually play. So we'll play it for you now. Thank you. That's a beautiful tune and composition. So I think we. I got 2 more songs and 3 more songs. This is a song that's like one I made up. It's got like a warning. It says "Look both ways." It's called, and you'll hear as it gets going. It's got 2 time signatures that go back and forth. It's 3/4, and then you look another way, and it's 4/4, and it's back to 3/4. And you have to keep looking both ways. And then at the end, there's a section in 7 where 3 + 4 is 7. So, so we'll see if we can keep it straight. 1, 2, 3, 1. made it. Now I get this. That's a happy tune to introduce. When Quincy before he was 20 and was learning to play clarinet, I wrote this song called Clarinet, like a clarinet but spelled with a Q. And I realized it was quite an imposition. It's a hard tune to play. It's like virtuoso requirements, but but he pulled it out, and we hadn't played it for a long time, but we played it recently, and Quincy remembered it, and I didn't. But I've got it. I think I got it back almost, and we're going to play that for a clarinet.
It's a really good study for the pinkies. Somebody, clarinet player.
It's got an introduction just made up yesterday. Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. No, that was fun. Yeah. Thank you. Like that was the best that tune's come out, I think. That's good. So we've got one more to play. We're going to play. I wonder.
Leave them on a very happy note here.
A hopeful, yeah, a pleading note.
Hopeful note.
Yeah, this is. I feel better about it. I don't. This is song's called "Don't Drop That Atomic Bomb on Me," and it's written. It's written by Charles Mingus, and an alternative title for this song was "Don't Drop That Atomic Bomb on My Head." But we're going to play it as he meant it, like in an old-fashioned blues way, and we can all yell out, "Don't drop that bomb on me!" Yeah. Do you want to do the tempo? Shall I? Okay.
Sonny Saul on the piano.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Peter Concilio on the bass.
Yeah, all right.
Tim Gilmore on the drums.
Yeah. Quincy Saul.
Quincy, thank you. Play the 3 books.
Yeah.
Thank you.